Story 9. The Tragic Tale of the Missing Olive Tree. Athens, with its towering Parthenon and intellectual legacy, has long been synonymous with culture, philosophy, and political achievement. But behind its majestic temples and grand debates lies a simple, yet significant, story one of a tree. Not just any tree, but the olive tree, a symbol of peace, prosperity, and the favor of the gods. According to myth, the founding of Athens was determined by a contest between the gods Poseidon and Athena. Both gods sought to offer the city a gift, one that would secure their favor and ensure the prosperity of the land. Poseidon, the god of the sea, struck the earth with his trident, bringing forth a saltwater spring. The people of Athens, though awed by the power of Poseidon's gift, found the water salty and undrinkable. In contrast, Athena, the goddess of wisdom, gifted the city an olive tree, a symbol of peace, prosperity, and sustenance. The olive tree would bear fruit, provide oil for cooking and anointing, and its wood could be used for tools, furniture, and even ships. It was a gift that represented not just material wealth, but a long-lasting source of nourishment and growth. Athena's gift won her the favor of the Athenians, and they named the city after her. The olive tree thus became a symbol of the city's enduring strength and connection to the divine, a sacred emblem of Athenian identity. The tree's significance was so great that it was said that an olive tree from the original grove still stood in the heart of Athens, a living reminder of the goddess' favor. It was planted on the Acropolis, and the Athenians believed it would be the symbol of their city's longevity. Yet, for all the stories of this divine gift, one of the most curious episodes in Athenian history revolves around the disappearance of this very olive tree. How could a tree that was so integral to the foundation of the city simply vanish? What caused this seemingly sacred symbol of Athena's blessing to be lost, never to be seen again? The disappearance of the olive tree is, in fact, tied to a series of political and religious events that took place centuries after the mythological contest between Athena and Poseidon. By the 5th century BCE, Athens was at the peak of its power. It was a city of unmatched intellectual and military influence, and its symbol, the olive tree, was a mark of divine favor. But this divine symbol was not immune to the turbulence of political change. As Athens became more powerful, so too did its rivals. Sparta, Corinth, and other city-states sought to undermine Athens' supremacy. At the height of the Peloponnesian War, when Athens was embroiled in conflict with Sparta, the olive tree became a casualty of war. During a particularly brutal siege of the Acropolis, in 406 BCE, the invading Spartan forces destroyed the olive tree, either cutting it down or burning it to the ground. Some records suggest that the tree was so deeply tied to the city's identity that its destruction became a symbolic blow to Athens, signaling the erosion of divine favor and the city's eventual decline. However, this story, as tragic as it may seem, has layers of symbolism that extend beyond the simple loss of a tree. The olive tree was not merely a symbol of the city's divine blessing, but also a reflection of its political and cultural identity. The tree's destruction marked the beginning of Athens' long struggle against its enemies, and the loss of such a potent symbol mirrored the growing internal fractures within the city-state itself. The olive tree's disappearance was not just an act of military conquest, but a metaphor for the fragility of power and the transient nature of even the most sacred symbols. But could it be that the tree wasn't truly lost, that it was not just a symbol of divine favor but something more? In the aftermath of the siege, some believed that the olive tree had not been destroyed, but merely hidden either by the Athenians in their desperate attempt to preserve the symbol of their greatness, or by the gods themselves, who had removed it from sight as a sign of the city's fading glory. The debate over the olive tree's fate persists in the mythological and historical record, with some suggesting that it had been miraculously restored in secret. For the Athenians, the olive tree was always more than just a plant. It was a symbol of their relationship with the gods, their prosperity, and their resilience. To lose it was to lose something far more profound than a simple tree. The olive tree represented everything the Athenians believed they had achieved: wisdom, civilization, and divine favor. Its destruction, whether real or symbolic, was a reflection of the fragility of all that Athens had built. The question remains, was the loss of the olive tree a sign of Athens' eventual downfall, or was it simply a moment in time, a single event among many that would shape the city's future? Did the Athenians, in the wake of their tragic loss, abandon the olive tree as a symbol of their power, or did they find a way to move forward, rebuilding from the ashes of their defeat? What does the disappearance of the tree say about the ways in which symbols, once thought to be eternal, can fade in the face of time, war, and change? The disappearance of the olive tree was not just a physical loss for Athens, it was a psychological and cultural blow. The tree had stood as a symbol of Athens' connection to the gods, of its wisdom and prosperity, and of its divine favor. It had been a tangible representation of the city's strength, and its destruction marked a shift in how the Athenians viewed their relationship with the divine. What is fascinating about the loss of the olive tree is how it speaks to the deep connection the Athenians felt between their political identity and their religious beliefs. The olive tree, a gift from Athena herself, was not simply a symbol of nature or a resource. It was a sacred emblem that represented the divine order that governed Athens' success. To lose it was to lose something more than just a piece of wood and leaves. It was a loss of the very essence of Athenian identity. The destruction of the olive tree in 406 BCE, during the height of Athens' involvement in the Peloponnesian War, seemed to signal the beginning of the city's decline. The tree had been a symbol of divine blessing, but now, as Athens faced its greatest challenges both from external enemies and internal strife, it seemed as though the gods were no longer on their side. The war had already taken a toll on Athens, and the loss of the tree served as a powerful metaphor for the unraveling of the city-state's power and prestige. In many ways, the destruction of the olive tree mirrored the larger destruction of Athens' glory. Just as the olive tree had provided for Athens through its fruits, its oil, and its wood, the city had once provided for its people through its wealth, military might, and cultural achievements. But now, just as the olive tree had been uprooted, Athens was being pulled into a maelstrom of warfare, political instability, and defeat. The olive tree's demise symbolized the collapse of the idealistic vision that had once guided Athens. However, as with many aspects of Athenian life, there was an element of resilience. Some Athenians believed that the destruction of the olive tree was not the final end, but a temporary setback. The olive tree, after all, had been a gift from Athena, a symbol of wisdom and renewal. In this light, the destruction of the tree could be seen not as a permanent loss, but as a test of the Athenians' strength. If they could endure the destruction of their sacred tree, they could, in time, rebuild. This idea of renewal became central to Athenian thinking in the aftermath of the olive tree's destruction. The Athenians had long understood the cyclical nature of power, success, and defeat, rise and fall, and they believed that even in the face of loss, there was always the possibility for rebirth. Just as the olive tree had once sprouted from the soil, so too could Athens regenerate itself from the ashes of its defeat. Moreover, the olive tree's loss raised questions about the intersection of political power and religious symbolism. Could a symbol so deeply tied to the divine be destroyed, or was there a higher force at play in its removal? Was the loss of the tree a divine punishment, or was it a sign that the Athenians were being asked to reconsider their reliance on the gods? The gods, after all, were capricious, and their favor was not to be taken for granted. For the Athenians, the loss of the tree was a reminder that their city's success was not solely due to their own efforts, it was also a gift from the divine, and that gift could be withdrawn at any time. The loss of the olive tree also spurred reflection on the role of symbols in the lives of the people. The tree had been more than just a practical resource, it had been a source of identity. Without it, what did Athens have left? The olive tree had provided both literal and metaphorical sustenance to the people of Athens. In its absence, the Athenians were forced to confront their own vulnerability. It was as if the gods had stripped away a part of their identity, leaving them to grapple with their own fallibility. Yet the very act of questioning what the destruction of the olive tree meant was, in itself, a sign of Athens' resilience. Rather than accepting the loss as an inevitable consequence of fate, the Athenians sought meaning in it. They looked for ways to understand the destruction not as a permanent downfall, but as a part of the larger cycle of growth and decay. In doing so, they reaffirmed their belief in their own capacity to endure, to rebuild, and to emerge from adversity stronger than before. In the years that followed, the olive tree would become a symbol of hope and renewal for Athens, a reminder that even in the face of destruction, there is always the possibility for new growth. Though the original tree may have been lost, the olive tree would continue to serve as a symbol of Athens' enduring spirit, its connection to the divine, and its ability to rise from the ashes of defeat. The story of the missing olive tree, then, was not one of finality, but of transformation, a reminder that even the most sacred symbols can be lost, only to be reborn in new forms. In the aftermath of the olive tree's destruction, the Athenians did not let the loss define them. The city, despite the dark clouds of war and turmoil, began to look inward and rebuild. Though the destruction of the sacred olive tree was a blow to their spiritual and cultural identity, it was also a catalyst for reflection, innovation, and ultimately, renewal. Athens, as the birthplace of democracy and the cradle of intellectual thought, had a history of resilience. Through its philosophers, artists, and statesmen, the city had shown time and again its ability to adapt, even in the most difficult of circumstances. The olive tree, in its symbolic role, was never truly gone. Rather, it had been incorporated into the collective consciousness of the people, reminding them that their true strength lay not in external gifts, but in their ability to endure and persevere. What is truly remarkable about the disappearance of the olive tree is how it mirrored Athens' own journey in the later years of the Peloponnesian War. The tree was a symbol of Athens' prosperity. Its oil fed the people, its wood built ships, and its fruit offered sustenance. But the tree's destruction coincided with a time of great peril, as Athens faced the consequences of its imperial overreach. The olive tree's disappearance seemed to echo the city's decline, the rapid fall of a once great empire, weakened by internal division and external pressures. Yet in true Athenian fashion, this loss was not the end. The olive tree, both as a symbol and as a literal resource, would eventually be restored, if not in the same form, then in spirit. Just as the Athenians rebuilt their city after the destruction wrought by the Persian invasion, they began to rebuild their identity after the loss of their sacred tree. One of the most powerful aspects of the Athenians' response to this loss was their ability to reinterpret their symbols of power and hope. Instead of mourning the olive tree's destruction as a permanent loss, they embraced it as a part of their narrative of resilience. It became a symbol not just of divine favor, but of the enduring spirit of Athens, the ability to find strength and purpose even in the face of adversity. Athens was never the same after the loss of the olive tree, but that was not necessarily a bad thing. It was a city that, in many ways, had grown too reliant on its past, on its great victories, and its divine blessings. The loss of the tree forced the people of Athens to reconsider what they truly valued. Was it the physical symbols of power and prosperity, or was it something deeper? The commitment to intellectual inquiry, civic engagement, and the pursuit of wisdom and virtue. In this sense, the loss of the olive tree was not just a setback, but a turning point, a moment of introspection that pushed Athens toward a more enduring and sustainable sense of identity. The olive tree, once a singular symbol of divine favor, became something greater in the collective imagination of the Athenians. It was no longer just a tree. It was a representation of their capacity for renewal, for rising above hardship, and for turning their losses into opportunities for growth. This idea of regeneration, of taking something that had been broken and restoring it, became central to Athenian thought and action. The olive tree was not forgotten, and its symbolism continued to shape Athens long after its physical presence had faded. As the city moved beyond the immediate effects of the Peloponnesian War, the idea of the olive tree remained a key part of the city's identity. It was no longer merely a tree that provided for Athens' material needs, but a powerful symbol of the city's ability to endure. Its resurgence, though not in the same form as before, became a testament to the fact that the true power of Athens was not in the divine gifts it received, but in its own ability to rebuild and adapt. In the end, the story of the missing olive tree is a story of resilience. It is a story of how, even in times of loss, Athens was able to reframe its narrative and find strength in the face of destruction. The olive tree, once lost, was reborn as a symbol not just of prosperity, but of the enduring spirit of Athens itself. As we look back on this tale, we see that the loss of the olive tree was not just about the end of an era, but about the beginning of a new chapter. It was about the realization that, in life and in history, symbols are not static. They evolve, they change, and they can be reinvented even after they seem to be lost forever. The olive tree, in this sense, was not merely a tree, but a living embodiment of Athens, legacy one that could withstand the passage of time and continue to inspire future generations. Reflection. The loss of the olive tree was not the loss of Athens, but rather the beginning of a new understanding of what it meant to be resilient, to rebuild, and to find strength in adversity. In the face of destruction, Athens found a way to adapt, and in doing so it created a lasting symbol of renewal. The olive tree's disappearance, while tragic, became a powerful reminder that, even when something vital is lost, there is always the possibility of rebirth and transformation. In the realm of ancient Greek theater, where tragedies dominated the stage, there was one play that stood out not for its dramatic depth, but for its absurdity: The Battle of the Frogs and Mice, a comedic satire penned by the playwright Aristophanes. This play, written and performed in 405 BCE, would go down in history not for its humor, but for how it became embroiled in a political and military struggle that, in hindsight, seems almost laughable. The play itself was a farcical parody, a mock epic that depicted a battle between frogs and mice, fighting for dominance in a marshy kingdom. On the surface, the Battle of the Frogs and Mice was exactly what its title suggested: a light-hearted, nonsensical comedy meant to entertain the masses and poke fun at the grandiose, often absurd nature of Greek myth and war. Aristophanes, known for his biting wit, used this satire to comment on the foolishness of war, the triviality of some conflicts, and, as was his trademark, the madness of Athens' leaders. Yet beneath the surface of this absurd comedy, the Battle of the Frogs and Mice took on a far more serious, if ironic, significance. The year was 405 BCE, and Athens was at the tail end of the Peloponnesian War, a conflict that had raged for nearly 3 decades. The war had drained Athens' resources, led to the destruction of much of the Athenian fleet, and left the city in a state of deep political and social instability. The comedy, in a way, was a reflection of the city's own sense of absurdity, its inability to maintain its power, its divisions, and its inability to see how the war had become a farce in its own right. Aristophanes, with his keen sense of irony, saw the theater as a place not just for entertainment, but for political and social commentary. His works, such as Lysistrata and the Clouds, often lampooned the political figures and ideologies of the day. However, the Battle of the Frogs and Mice was particularly daring. It ridiculed not just the ongoing war, but the very idea that Athens, in its desperation, could continue to maintain its superiority over Sparta and the other Greek city-states. Through the absurd antics of frogs and mice, Aristophanes made an important political statement. The war had become as ridiculous as a battle between amphibians and rodents. At the time, Athens was under the leadership of Alcibiades, during his brief return to power after exile, and his controversial, often unpredictable nature had made him both a symbol of hope and a figure of contempt. Aristophanes, who was no stranger to making sharp political critiques, used the battle of the frogs and mice to mock the situation, painting Athens' military and political struggles as nothing more than a childish squabble. In this context, the Battle of the Frogs and Mice became more than just a stage production. It became a reflection of Athens' deteriorating state, a city embroiled in a war that seemed as ridiculous and futile as the battle between frogs and mice. But what truly made the play memorable and tragic for Athens was how it inadvertently became part of a larger political and military conflict that Athens would ultimately lose. The connection between the Battle of the Frogs and Mice and the political atmosphere of Athens is more profound than a mere theatrical critique. It became a reflection of the city's frustration with the ongoing Peloponnesian War, and more specifically, its leadership. Aristophanes, through his comedic and absurd portrayal of frogs and mice at war, created a powerful satire of Athens' own military and political situation. The absurdity of the play mirrored the city-state's failure to achieve a decisive victory in the war, and in a broader sense, it represented how Athens had been mired in a conflict with no clear end or purpose. By 405 BCE, Athens was in a dire position. The war with Sparta, which had begun in 431 BCE, had ravaged both sides. The city had seen its great fleet repeatedly shattered, its resources drained, and its people divided. The once mighty Athenian empire was crumbling, and many saw the war as an endless cycle of misery. Aristophanes' play, with its ludicrous battle between frogs and mice, was a sharp commentary on how the war itself had become an absurd spectacle, fighting for reasons that seemed increasingly disconnected from any meaningful goals. But the most ironic part of this situation was how the Battle of the Frogs and Mice became a lightning rod for political controversy. Aristophanes, always willing to push boundaries, used his comedy to mock not only the war but also the political leaders of Athens. Alcibiades, the controversial leader who had once been exiled but had recently returned to Athens, became a target for Aristophanes' sharp wit. The play, in its satirical absurdity, underscored the city's collective disillusionment with its leadership. Alcibiades, known for his personal ambition and his shifting allegiances between Athens, Sparta, and Persia, embodied the political chaos of the time. Athens, despite its admiration of Alcibiades in earlier years, was now questioning his leadership. He had led the city to some victories, but his defection to Sparta and then Persia, and his controversial decisions, left many Athenians skeptical of his loyalty. The satirical portrayal in Aristophanes' play of Athens' war efforts and its leadership as a foolish, endless struggle struck a nerve among the populace. It was not just an attack on the war but on the ability of Athens' leaders to guide the city to victory. The comedic nature of the play, with frogs battling mice over trivial issues, felt all too familiar to an Athens exhausted by war. However, despite the deep political commentary woven into Aristophanes' play, the tragic irony is that the events of the Battle of the Frogs and Mice didn't just stay confined to the stage. The comedic portrayal of Athens' feudal war effort mirrored the actual political and military disarray that would lead to the downfall of the city. The year 405 BCE saw the defeat of Athens' fleet at the Battle of Aegispotami, a decisive blow to the city's war effort. This defeat, combined with the political instability, marked the beginning of the end for Athens in the Peloponnesian War. In the immediate aftermath of the play's performance and the battle's defeat, many saw the comedy as an omen. The frogs and mice, who fought over meaningless territory and petty conflicts, now seemed an apt metaphor for Athens' own struggle. The city, in its desperation, had engaged in a conflict that had stretched on far too long and resulted in nothing but destruction. The metaphor of the frogs and mice battling, while humorous on the surface, had struck a deeper chord, a realization that Athens had become mired in a feudal war, led by figures who seemed more interested in personal gain than the common good. Aristophanes' play, in its ridiculousness, spoke to a deeper political truth. Athens had reached a point of absurdity in its prolonged conflict with Sparta. Despite the powerful legacy of Athens, democratic ideals and its contributions to philosophy, art, and politics, the city was now engaged in a destructive war with no clear purpose. The loss of the olive tree earlier in the century had been a symbol of Athens' decline. The loss at Aegispotami and the folly depicted in the Battle of the Frogs and Mice represented the final unraveling of Athenian power and influence. But there was another layer to the play's impact, how it reflected the larger role of satire and humor in Greek political life. Aristophanes, through his comedy, allowed Athenians to openly criticize their leaders and reflect on the absurdity of their circumstances, even in a time of war. While the play mocked Athens' military efforts, it also provided a space for the people to voice their frustrations and engage in political discourse. This, in itself, was a form of resistance, a way for the citizens of Athens to question their rulers, even as the war raged on. Despite the tragedy that would soon unfold for Athens, the Battle of the Frogs and Mice remains a testament to the power of satire and humor in holding a mirror to society. While the city's power and influence waned, Aristophanes' work endured as a reminder of the city's once great spirit, its ability to laugh at itself, even as it faced its inevitable decline. As Athens faced the final blows in the Peloponnesian War, the Battle of the Frogs and Mice remained a curious footnote in the grand arc of its decline. The defeat at the Battle of Aegispotami in 405 BCE sealed Athens' fate. Its navy was shattered, its supply lines cut, and its power had been irreparably weakened. Despite the tragic consequences of the war, Aristophanes' play continued to serve as a poignant reflection on the absurdity of the situation. Athens, once the beacon of culture, philosophy, and military prowess, was now crumbling under the weight of its own hubris. The city had overextended itself, and its grand ambitions had led to a war that sapped its resources and spirit. The loss of the olive tree had symbolized the erosion of divine favor. The play, The Battle of the Frogs and Mice, was a humorous yet sharp critique of the way Athens had turned a noble cause into an absurd, never-ending struggle. The frogs, with their croaking cries of feudal battle, mirrored the very situation Athens found itself in, engaged in a conflict that no longer made sense, driven by the pride and desperation of its leaders. What is remarkable about Aristophanes' play is how it transcended its comedic nature and became a vehicle for political commentary. The laughter it elicited from the audience was not just the result of absurd scenarios on stage, but also an acknowledgement of the deeper truth embedded in the play. In this moment of national crisis, Aristophanes used humor to hold up a mirror to Athens, allowing its citizens to see the folly of their situation, if only for a brief moment. The Battle of the Frogs and Mice was not simply a trivial farce. It was a critique of the very systems of power, warfare, and leadership that had led Athens to this point. In the wake of Athens' defeat, the Battle of the Frogs and Mice continued to resonate with the people. While the city's political structure faltered and its intellectual dominance waned, the play remained a powerful reminder of the fragility of great civilizations. The themes of pride, ambition, and the absurdity of war that Aristophanes explored in his comedy were as relevant in the aftermath of Athens' defeat as they had been during the height of its power. The play became, in many ways, a symbol of Athens' fall, a city that had once been the center of learning and democratic ideals, now reduced to a tragic, self-inflicted wound. But in the years following the war, Athens would eventually recover. The city-state, though never to return to its former grandeur, would continue to be a center of learning, philosophy, and culture. The aftermath of the Peloponnesian War forced Athens to reconsider its values and its approach to power. The lessons of the war, the dangers of unchecked ambition, the absurdity of perpetual conflict would be absorbed into the collective consciousness of its citizens. In the context of this recovery, the legacy of the Battle of the Frogs and Mice was not just about the humor of the play, but about its deeper message, the importance of self-awareness, reflection, and the ability to laugh at one's own folly. In a way, the play became a touchstone for future generations, reminding them that no empire, no matter how great, was immune to the consequences of its own excesses. Aristophanes' work continued to echo through the ages, as scholars and citizens alike came to recognize the enduring relevance of his satire. The play was not just an indictment of Athens' military misadventures, it was also a broader commentary on the human condition. The frogs and mice, engaged in an endless and pointless battle, symbolized not just the absurdity of Athens' situation, but the often absurd nature of human conflict itself. The tragedy of the Battle of the Frogs and Mice was not just in its humor, but in its truth. Athens, in its quest for glory, had forgotten the essential lesson that Aristophanes so deftly delivered, that even the most noble causes can descend into absurdity when driven by pride, when war becomes a game, and when leaders lose sight of the greater good. Reflection. As the dust settled on Athens after its defeat in the Peloponnesian War, Aristophanes, the Battle of the Frogs and Mice remained as a reminder of how easily a noble cause can become absurd. The play's tragic irony was that it reflected the very nature of the war that had consumed Athens, a battle that had started with ideals of greatness, but had ended in destruction and farce. In the end, it was not just the tragedy of the war itself that resonated with the Athenians, but the realization that they had become the frogs and mice of their own making, battling endlessly without purpose or understanding. In 404 BCE, Athens, the birthplace of democracy, found itself at the brink of its greatest political crisis. The city, which had long prided itself on its democratic ideals, was overtaken by a brutal oligarchy, the 30 Tyrants. This event would mark a turning point in Athenian history, one that would forever change the nature of its governance and its people's relationship with power. The fall of Athens came not through external enemies but from within. After their crushing defeat by Sparta in the Peloponnesian War, Athens was left in a state of disarray. The Athenian fleet was destroyed, the empire dismantled, and the economy in ruins. The city was not only physically weakened but also politically fractured, with rival factions vying for control. It was during this moment of vulnerability that a group of oligarchs, backed by the Spartan victors, seized control of Athens in a violent coup. This group, known as the 30 Tyrants, was led by a cadre of Athenian aristocrats who sought to impose a government that was entirely antithetical to the democracy that Athens had championed for nearly 2 centuries. The 30 Tyrants were not interested in the rule of the people, but in consolidating power among a select few. Their rule, though brief, would leave an indelible mark on Athens and its democratic legacy. The tyrants came to power after the fall of Athens, imposed by Sparta as part of the peace treaty. Sparta had been angered by Athens' imperialism, and the defeat in the war left them seeking to weaken their former rival permanently. The 30, under the leadership of figures like Critias and the Rhamines, were given the power to govern Athens. They immediately set about dismantling Athenian democracy, eliminating democratic institutions, and centralizing power in the hands of a small, elite group. What followed was a reign of terror. The 30 tyrants, aided by a small military force, began executing their political opponents, including many leading democratic figures. They targeted not only those who had actively opposed the coup, but also ordinary citizens suspected of sympathizing with the democratic ideals of Athens. The scale of repression was severe, with many executed, exiled, or imprisoned. The city that had once prided itself on freedom, debate, and intellectual diversity was now a shadow of itself. But the rule of the 30 tyrants was not to last long. Their grip on power was weakened by internal divisions, and the democratic spirit that had long been embedded in Athenian society was not easily extinguished. Over the next year, Athens' citizens began to rise against the oligarchs, emboldened by the belief that their democratic way of life was worth fighting for. The rule of the 30 tyrants was a dark period in Athens' history, but it was also a testament to the resilience of the Athenian people and their enduring commitment to democracy. As the tyrants consolidated power, it seemed as though Athens' political ideals had been crushed under the weight of oppression. Yet, even in the darkest days, the spirit of democracy was far from dead. The overthrow of the 30 tyrants was sparked by a combination of internal dissent and external pressures. The tyrants' reign of terror was not universally accepted, even among the oligarchs themselves. The group was deeply divided, and their methods of governing, which relied on fear and violence, alienated many of their supporters. Among the oligarchs, some grew disillusioned with the brutality of their rule. Notably, the Ramines, one of the leaders of the 30, began to question their increasingly harsh tactics. He tried to moderate their actions, arguing that the brutal purges were damaging to the stability of their rule. This internal division weakened the tyrant's power and provided an opening for resistance. Meanwhile, on the outside, many exiled democratic leaders and soldiers began to rally against the oligarchy. These figures were committed to restoring Athens' democracy and were willing to fight for it. The democratic forces were not alone in their desire for change. Sparta, which had installed the 30 as rulers, was facing its own problems, including the possibility of internal revolt and the resurgence of Athenian power. The idea of a long-lasting oligarchy in Athens was becoming untenable, and some Spartan leaders recognized that the brutality of the 30 was only strengthening the democratic cause. By 403 BCE, Athens' democratic resistance had coalesced around a military force that was determined to overthrow the oligarchs. The leader of this revolt was Thrasybulus, a former Athenian general who had fought in the Peloponnesian War. Thrasybulus led a band of democratic exiles and soldiers to the city of Phyle, where they gathered support and prepared to march on Athens. The Athenians were not yet ready to abandon their democratic ideals, and this was the moment of their resurgence. The Athenians, supported by the exiles, defeated the forces of the 30 at Phyle and began their march back into Athens. In response, the 30 tyrants tried to muster their forces, but their support had already started to fracture. They no longer had the power to crush the rebellion, and the democratic forces, growing in number and strength, soon forced the tyrants to retreat. The fall of the 30 tyrants was as swift as their rise. In 403 BCE, the oligarchs were overthrown, and democracy was restored to Athens. The Athenians, in a remarkable show of political maturity, decided not to seek revenge on their former rulers. Instead, they opted for a policy of amnesty. Those who had supported the 30 were allowed to return to their homes, provided they did not seek to undermine the restored democracy. The restoration of democracy in Athens marked a moment of reflection for the city-state. The Athenians had experienced firsthand the dangers of power concentrated in the hands of a few. The brief but brutal rule of the 30 tyrants had taught them a harsh lesson in the fragility of democracy. In the aftermath of their victory, the Athenians were determined to ensure that such a tyrannical regime would never again take hold. Athenian democracy, though restored, was not without its flaws, but the experience of living under the 30 tyrants left an indelible mark on the city's political consciousness. The Athenians had learned the value of participation, the importance of checks and balances, and the necessity of keeping power in the hands of the people. While the 30 tyrants had attempted to impose an oligarchy through fear and violence, they had ultimately failed because of the enduring strength of the democratic ideals that had long been embedded in Athenian society. The restoration of democracy was not just a political victory, it was a cultural one as well. The city, which had once been the epicenter of intellectual and artistic achievements, reclaimed its place as a beacon of philosophical and democratic thought. Athens, though weakened by years of war and internal strife, would once again become a center of learning, debate, and political experimentation. The fall of the 30 tyrants and the restoration of democracy in 403 BCE marked a turning point for Athens. Though the city had suffered significant political and military losses, the return of democratic rule allowed Athens to once again flourish as a center of culture, philosophy, and political thought. The victory over the tyrants was a powerful reminder of the resilience of Athenian ideals, but it also underscored the fragility of democracy itself. In the aftermath of the tyrants' downfall, Athens faced the difficult task of rebuilding. The war with Sparta had decimated the city's resources, and the oligarchic rule of the 30 had fractured the social and political fabric of the city. Yet, Athens' citizens were determined to restore their democratic system, believing that their greatest strength lay in their ability to govern themselves collectively, rather than leaving power in the hands of a few. One of the key decisions made during the restoration was the policy of amnesty. Instead of seeking revenge on the former supporters of the 30, the democratic leaders chose reconciliation. This decision was instrumental in stabilizing Athens after the turmoil. The amnesty allowed the city to avoid a prolonged civil war, and it helped to restore a sense of unity among its people. While the ex-tyrants were not completely absolved of their actions, the focus was placed on moving forward, not dwelling on past grievances. Yet, even as Athens regained its democratic footing, the lessons learned from the tyranny of the 30 were not easily forgotten. The Athenians realized that their democracy was not infallible. The rise of the oligarchic regime had shown them how fragile the balance of power could be, and how easily a group of ambitious men could subvert their system. As a result, the restored democracy was shaped by a renewed commitment to safeguard against such threats. The political landscape of Athens in the years following the restoration of democracy saw a renewed emphasis on civic participation and vigilance. The city sought to strengthen its democratic institutions, reinforcing the power of the assembly and the courts, where ordinary citizens played a direct role in governance. Athens, once again, became a place where philosophical discussions and political debates flourished, and its democratic ideals were, at least for a time, fully restored. However, despite the apparent restoration of Athenian democracy, the shadows of the 30 tyrants' rule continued to linger. The amnesty may have helped heal some of the wounds, but the memory of how easily Athens had been overtaken by oligarchs was a constant reminder of how precarious democracy could be. The fall of the 30 had shown that democracy was vulnerable not just to external enemies, but also to internal factions who were willing to use force to seize power. The lesson that democracy must be continually safeguarded would echo throughout the rest of Athenian history. Athens would never fully recover its former glory. The restoration of democracy was a victory, but it was also a reminder of the deep divisions and challenges the city would continue to face. Though the city would remain a center of learning, it would no longer wield the same power and influence it once had over the Greek world. Athens' eventual defeat by Macedonia under Philip II in 338 BCE would mark the end of its political dominance. Nevertheless, the legacy of the 30 tyrants and their fall had a lasting impact on Athenian political thought. The story of their rise to power and their eventual downfall became a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked authority and the fragility of democratic institutions. The Athenians, who had once taken their democracy for granted, now saw it as something worth defending at all costs. The political experience of the 30 tyrants shaped the thinking of future philosophers, including Plato, who had witnessed the events firsthand. Plato's writings, particularly in the Republic, reflect his concerns about the dangers of democracy and the instability that could arise from factionalism. For Plato, the fall of the 30 tyrants was a clear example of the flaws within Athenian democracy, which he believed could easily give way to mob rule or be exploited by opportunistic leaders. While his ideal government was far from democratic, the events of 404 BCE clearly had a profound influence on his views about governance and power. In the end, the story of the 30 tyrants serves as both a tragedy and a triumph. It is a tragedy in the sense that it represents the collapse of Athens, democratic ideals, and the suffering it caused for many of its citizens. But it is also a triumph, because Athens, after experiencing the crushing effects of tyranny, was able to restore democracy and regain a measure of stability. The fall of the 30 tyrants and the restoration of democracy ultimately contributed to the philosophical and political evolution of the Western world. Athens, despite its setbacks, continued to be a symbol of democracy, not just for its citizens, but for future generations who would look to the city as an example of both the fragility and resilience of democratic systems. Reflection. The story of the 30 tyrants is a powerful reminder of how easily a democratic system can be undermined, and how difficult it is to restore once it has been lost. It teaches us the importance of vigilance, the dangers of factionalism, and the necessity of protecting democratic ideals against those who seek to concentrate power in the hands of the few. The Athenians, in the end, learned that democracy is not a static system, but a fragile structure that requires constant care, participation, and commitment to prevent it from falling into the hands of those who would abuse it. At its height, Athens was the undisputed power of the Aegean, a city-state whose naval prowess dominated the seas and whose intellectual achievements were unrivaled. The Athenian Empire, built upon the foundation of the Delian League, stretched from the Aegean to Asia Minor, and Athens ruled over a vast collection of tribute-paying allies. The city's wealth, military might, and cultural influence were unparalleled, and its leaders, from Pericles to Alcibiades, were celebrated as figures of great ambition and vision. But this empire, as grand as it was, came with a price, a cost that would eventually lead to Athens' downfall. The Athenian Empire, in all its glory, was a fragile construct. Its power rested on its navy, which allowed it to control trade routes, enforce its will upon its allies, and defend itself against external threats. However, the fleet that had brought Athens such success would also be the cause of its eventual destruction. The loss of the Athenian fleet in the Battle of Aegispotami in 405 BCE, just a year before the end of the Peloponnesian War, was a devastating blow to the city-state. It marked the culmination of a long period of military struggles and internal divisions that had left Athens vulnerable. In the end, the loss of the fleet would represent not just a military defeat, but the symbolic collapse of the very foundation of Athenian power. The Athenian fleet had been the city's pride. It was built on a foundation of naval innovation and strategic brilliance, designed to project Athenian influence far beyond the walls of the city. The triremes, sleek, fast, and deadly, were the backbone of Athens' military force. These ships, manned by a highly trained and skilled crew, had won Athens many victories and enabled the city to maintain control over its empire. Under the leadership of Pericles, Athens had turned its naval superiority into political leverage, using its fleet to enforce its will and exact tribute from its allies. But with the ongoing war against Sparta, the resources needed to maintain such a powerful fleet began to stretch thin. The Athenians faced internal political strife, and their military leadership was increasingly divided. Alcibiades, who had once been hailed as the city's savior, had switched allegiances between Athens, Sparta, and Persia, leaving the city uncertain and politically fragmented. The very empire that had been the city's strength was beginning to crumble under the weight of war, betrayal, and mismanagement. By the time of the Battle of Aegispotami, Athens had already suffered several significant defeats, and the Spartans, under the leadership of Lysander, were closing in. In a final, desperate attempt to break the Spartan blockade, the Athenians sailed to Aegispotami in Thrace. The Athenian fleet, despite its numerical superiority, was caught off guard. In a crushing defeat, the Spartans destroyed the Athenian fleet and captured the majority of its ships. The loss of the fleet at Aegispotami sealed the fate of Athens. The city, already weakened by years of war, no longer had the naval power to defend itself. Without its fleet, Athens could no longer sustain its empire or project power. The siege of the city began almost immediately after the defeat, and within a year, Athens was forced to surrender to Sparta, bringing an end to the Peloponnesian War. The loss at Aegispotami was not just a military defeat for Athens, it was the moment when its empire collapsed. Without the protection of its mighty fleet, Athens was exposed, vulnerable, and ripe for conquest. The city had relied on its naval power to maintain control over its tributaries, enforce its laws, and secure its trade routes. Without it, Athens' influence evaporated, and the once great empire was reduced to a shadow of its former self. In the months following the disaster at Aegispotami, the Athenians faced a harsh reality. The Spartan forces, having decisively defeated the Athenian fleet, laid siege to Athens, cutting off its access to supplies and reinforcements. The city, which had once been the heart of intellectual and political achievement, now faced starvation and decay. The Athenians, who had been proud of their power, now found themselves at the mercy of their enemies. The city's leadership, already fractured by political infighting and the defeat of Alcibiades, struggled to maintain order. The Spartans, aided by the Persian Empire, which had grown increasingly hostile to Athens, began to tighten their grip on the city. Athens' walls, which had once symbolized its invincibility, now stood as a testament to its vulnerability. The Athenians, with their democratic ideals and one strong naval might, were left to negotiate with their conquerors. In 404 BCE, Athens was forced to surrender to Sparta. The terms of the peace treaty were harsh. Athens had to dismantle its walls, disband its fleet, and accept a Spartan-backed oligarchy that would rule the city. The very structure of Athenian society, which had been built on the foundation of democracy and naval power, was effectively destroyed. The loss of the fleet, combined with the political disarray within Athens, meant that the city could no longer function as the political and cultural leader it once was. The establishment of the oligarchy known as the 30 Tyrants further demonstrated the extent of Athens' downfall. Led by a group of aristocrats, the tyrants imposed their will on the city, overthrowing the democracy that had once defined Athens. The period of their rule was marked by violence, repression, and terror. Many of Athens' democratic leaders were executed or exiled, and the city was forced to live under a regime that stripped away the freedoms its citizens had once taken for granted. Yet, despite the loss of its empire and the suffering caused by the 30 tyrants, Athens was not entirely defeated. After a brief period of oligarchic rule, a democratic uprising led by the general Thrasybulus restored Athens' democracy in 403 BCE. The restoration of the democratic government was not a return to the grandeur of the past, but it was a testament to the resilience of Athenian ideals. The Athenians, having lost everything, were determined to rebuild their democracy, even if it was no longer the powerful empire it had once been. The fall of the Athenian Empire marked the end of an era for Greece. The city that had once been the beacon of democracy, philosophy, and culture was now humbled. The empire that had spread its influence across the Aegean was no more. But in its place, Athens would begin to rebuild, not through military conquest or imperial expansion, but through the strength of its people and the legacy of its ideas. While the loss of the fleet and the collapse of the empire were devastating, Athens' intellectual and cultural legacy would endure. The ideals of democracy, the philosophy of Socrates, the dramas of Sophocles, and the teachings of Plato would continue to influence the world long after the city's military power had faded. The Athenians had lost their empire, but they had not lost their identity as the intellectual and philosophical center of the Greek world. The fall of the Athenian Empire, symbolized by the loss of the fleet at Aegispotami and the subsequent collapse of democratic governance under the 30 tyrants, marked a pivotal moment in the history of Greece. Yet, while the city-state of Athens could no longer claim the political and military supremacy it once held, its legacy endured in ways that would shape the course of Western civilization for centuries to come. After Athens' restoration to democracy in 403 BCE, the city began the slow process of rebuilding its cultural and intellectual life. The democratic system was re-established, albeit with certain limitations, as the Athenians struggled to reconcile their values of participation and civic engagement with the reality of a city greatly diminished in power. The empire, once so vast and influential, was gone, and the Athenians had to find new ways to define their place in the world. In many ways, the fall of the Athenian Empire became a turning point in the city's development. The Athenians, deeply aware of their vulnerability after the Peloponnesian War and the tyranny that followed, turned increasingly inward. They focused on intellectual and cultural achievements rather than military expansion. The city became a hub for philosophical inquiry, artistic expression, and political thought. It was during this time that philosophers like Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle would lay the foundations for Western philosophy. The cultural achievements of Athens, particularly in the fields of philosophy, drama, and rhetoric, provided a new form of influence that was no longer dependent on military might or empire building. The Athenians, in a sense, reinvented themselves as a beacon of intellectual and cultural light, even as their military power faded. The tragic irony, of course, was that the loss of the empire, once the source of so much pride, freed Athens from the need to assert dominance through force. The empire's collapse left the city vulnerable to external threats, but it also allowed the Athenians to shift their focus from war to knowledge. This shift had profound consequences for the development of Western thought, as the decline of Athens' military might coincided with the rise of its intellectual contributions. Athens' intellectual renaissance in the aftermath of the Peloponnesian War serves as a potent reminder of the enduring power of ideas. Though the city had lost its empire, it had not lost its capacity to inspire and innovate. In the centuries that followed, Athens continued to influence the world through its philosophy, art, and political ideals. The legacy of democracy, begun in the shadow of the Acropolis, would echo through the corridors of history, inspiring the founding principles of modern democratic societies. In this way, the fall of the Athenian Empire became a lesson in the limitations of military power and the enduring strength of intellectual and cultural influence. The Athenians learned the hard way that empires, however grand, are fragile and subject to the ravages of time, war, and internal strife. Yet, through their focus on knowledge and civic engagement, they demonstrated that true greatness lies not in military conquest or territorial expansion, but in the ability to shape the minds of future generations. The lessons of Athens' fall are timeless. Empires may rise and fall, but ideas have the power to transcend borders and eras. The collapse of Athens' imperial power, though a tragic loss at the time, ultimately paved the way for the city to become the intellectual center of the ancient world, a place where democracy, philosophy, and art flourished, influencing the course of Western civilization for millennia. As Athens rebuilt its democracy and shifted its focus to intellectual pursuits, the city also laid the groundwork for the philosophical and cultural movements that would follow in the centuries to come. The ideals of reason, justice, and civic participation, though tested by the fall of the empire, remain the bedrock of Athenian identity, continuing to resonate in the works of philosophers like Plato and Aristotle. Reflection. The fall of the Athenian Empire, with its crushing defeat and loss of power, is a tragic but ultimately redemptive story. Athens' military defeat was painful, but it also allowed the city to reorient itself toward intellectual and cultural pursuits. The city's survival, despite the loss of its empire, serves as a testament to the enduring power of ideas. In the end, Athens' legacy was not defined by its military might, but by its contributions to philosophy, democracy, and the arts gifts that would shape the future of the Western world. In the ancient world, few figures are as legendary as Alexander the Great, whose conquests spanned continents and whose empire stretched from Greece to India. Born in 356 BCE in the Macedonian court of King Philip II, Alexander's rise to power seemed almost preordained. His father, a brilliant military strategist, had united the fractious Greek city-states, and upon his assassination in 336 BCE, Alexander inherited a kingdom poised for greatness. From a young age, Alexander was steeped in the arts of war and leadership, mentored by his philosopher tutor, Aristotle, who imparted to him a deep love of knowledge, a fascination with the natural world, and an enduring respect for Greek culture. But it was the martial and political aspects of his education that would shape Alexander's destiny. As a military commander, he was unparalleled. He led his troops with a mix of brilliance and charisma, earning the loyalty of those who fought alongside him. By the time he was 20, Alexander had already shown his prowess as a leader, quelling uprisings in Greece and asserting his dominance over the region. But his sights were set far beyond the borders of Macedon. His ambition, perhaps inspired by his father's vision or his own desire for glory, was to conquer the known world and create an empire that would unite the East and West. In 334 BCE, he began his campaign against the Persian Empire, led by King Darius III, and the world would soon be swept by his unprecedented military achievements. Within just a few years, Alexander had shattered the Persian forces at the Battle of Granicus, followed by decisive victories at Issus and Gaugamela. His forces, though often outnumbered, defeated the Persians in battle after battle. His army swept through Asia Minor, Syria, Egypt, and Mesopotamia, leaving a trail of victories and broken empires behind. Alexander's conquest of Persia was not just about military triumph, it was about vision. He sought not only to defeat the Persians but to merge cultures, spreading Greek culture across the East and incorporating the traditions of the peoples he conquered. He founded cities, most notably Alexandria in Egypt, which would later become centers of learning and culture. His ambition was not just to conquer, but to create a lasting legacy, one that would blend the civilizations of the East and West. Yet despite his brilliance and ambition, Alexander's life would end in tragedy. In 323 BCE, at the age of just 32, Alexander died suddenly in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar II in Babylon. His death, surrounded by rumors and mystery, would leave the world in shock and his empire in turmoil. The cause of his death has been the subject of much speculation. Some believe that he succumbed to an illness, possibly malaria or typhoid fever, while others have suggested that he was poisoned. However, what truly remains a mystery is not the cause of death, but the fate of the empire he had built. Would his vision of a unified world have come to fruition had he lived longer? Would his legacy have been even greater if he had lived to fulfill his dream of creating a vast, harmonious empire stretching from Greece to India? In the wake of his death, Alexander's empire quickly fragmented. Without his unifying leadership, his generals, known as the Diadochi, began to carve up the empire among themselves. What was once a vast, united domain was divided into warring kingdoms, each led by a former general. The dream of a single, unified empire evaporated almost as quickly as it had been realized. Alexander, the conqueror of the world, was no longer there to hold the pieces together. The death of Alexander the Great in 323 BCE sent shockwaves through the ancient world. The great conqueror, who had reshaped the map of the known world, left behind no clear heir. His son, Alexander IV, was an infant, and without a strong leader to guide the empire, it quickly descended into chaos. The once unified territories, stretching from Greece to India, fractured into warring factions led by Alexander's former generals, men who had once been his trusted companions, but who now saw an opportunity to seize power for themselves. These generals, known as the Diadochi, meaning successors, quickly began to fight for control over the vast empire. The empire that Alexander had built was not based on lasting political or administrative systems, but on the charisma and leadership of a single individual. When that individual passed, the empire was left without the unity that had been its greatest strength. The result was a series of brutal wars of succession, which would last for decades. The kingdom of Ptolemaic Egypt, the Seleucid Empire in the east, and the Antigonid dynasty in Macedonia and Greece were the major states to emerge from the fragmentation of Alexander's empire. These kingdoms, though rooted in Alexander's conquests, were often at odds with one another. The wars between the Diadochi led to constant shifting of borders and political alliances, and the once glorious empire quickly became divided and unstable. Despite the division, Alexander's influence endured in the cities he had founded, particularly Alexandria in Egypt. Alexandria became one of the most important cultural and intellectual centers of the ancient world. The Library of Alexandria, the largest and most significant library of the ancient world, housed countless works of literature, philosophy, and science. It became a beacon of learning, attracting scholars from all corners of the Mediterranean. Alexander's vision of a cross-cultural empire was, in a sense, realized in these cities, where Greek and Eastern cultures blended and exchanged ideas, a legacy that would continue to shape the world for centuries. However, while Alexander's vision of a unified empire may have endured in certain pockets of his conquered lands, the political fragmentation of his empire meant that his grand design of a united world under one ruler was not to be. The generals who had been loyal to him, such as Ptolemy, Seleucus, and Antigonus, were now fighting for control, each establishing their own dynasties and fortifying their power. In this fractured world, Alexander's dream of a single empire became an illusion. The Hellenistic age, which Alexander's conquests had ushered in, would continue to thrive in certain areas, particularly in Egypt and the eastern Mediterranean. But it was no longer under the banner of a unified empire. The Hellenistic kingdoms that emerged from Alexander's legacy were distinct, each with its own rulers, ideologies, and priorities. While Greek culture and influence spread far and wide, the empire itself was gone, and Alexander's singular vision of a vast, all-encompassing world ruled by one man would never be fully realized. Perhaps one of the most tragic aspects of Alexander's death was the way his legacy was distorted by his sudden absence. The empire that had once been united under his leadership was fragmented, and the achievements of his conquests were overshadowed by the internal power struggles that followed. The charismatic and visionary leader who had promised to unite East and West was replaced by ambitious men who saw the empire as a prize to be won, not a world to be ruled. But Alexander's death also marked the end of a chapter in history. The world that he had conquered was never the same again. His empire, though brief, had been the catalyst for the spread of Greek culture across the ancient world. The Hellenistic influence on art, architecture, language, and philosophy would endure for centuries, even as political unity dissolved. The blending of Greek and Eastern cultures, facilitated by Alexander's empire, helped lay the foundations for the Roman Empire, which would eventually inherit much of Alexander's cultural legacy. Yet, for all his conquests and ambition, Alexander the Great would not live to see the full realization of his dream. His death left a legacy that was both magnificent and tragic, a world once united by his vision, now scattered by his absence. The very empire he had built with such promise fell apart, and in the centuries that followed, Alexander's name would be remembered not just for the territories he conquered, but for the empire that was lost in the wake of his death. Despite the rapid fragmentation of his empire after his death, the legacy of Alexander the Great has endured for more than 2 millennia, though often in complex and contradictory forms. The vast territories he conquered, the cities he founded, and the cultural exchanges he encouraged left an indelible mark on the ancient world, one that would shape the future of the Mediterranean, the Near East, and beyond. Yet his untimely death and the ensuing power struggles meant that his dream of a unified empire was never fully realized. While the political unity of his empire dissolved after his passing, the Hellenistic world that Alexander created continued to flourish in a different form. Greek culture, language, and ideas spread to the farthest corners of the ancient world, from Egypt and Mesopotamia to the Indian subcontinent. This was a legacy that could not be erased by the disintegration of his military conquests. In Egypt, Alexander's foundation of Alexandria as a major port and intellectual center would ensure that Greek culture endured long after his death. The Library of Alexandria, one of the largest and most renowned libraries of the ancient world, became a beacon of learning and intellectual exchange. Philosophers, mathematicians, and scientists gathered there to share ideas, and the study of Greek philosophy, science, and literature became deeply ingrained in the intellectual traditions of the region. Even in regions far beyond Egypt, Alexander's vision of a cross-cultural world continued to influence the course of history. The blending of Greek and Eastern cultures, the Hellenistic synthesis, would continue for centuries. In Central Asia and India, Alexander's campaigns and the settlements he founded led to the fusion of Greek thought with local traditions. In particular, the spread of Greek art, architecture, and coinage influenced the regions of Bactria and the Indo-Greek kingdom, where Hellenistic culture survived for several centuries, well beyond the death of the conqueror. Perhaps the most significant aspect of Alexander's legacy is his role in spreading Greek ideas and establishing a new cultural era that would influence the development of both the Roman Empire and the Byzantine Empire. The Romans, in particular, were deeply influenced by Greek philosophy, art, and governance, with many aspects of Greek culture being adopted by Roman elites. This connection between the Greeks and Romans meant that Alexander's vision of a united, Hellenistic world, though not politically realized, would be carried forward through the Roman Empire, which would dominate the Western world for centuries. But while Alexander's cultural impact was far-reaching, his death also marked the beginning of the decline of the world he had built. The wars of the Diadochi, the successors who fought to carve up his empire, revealed a bitter truth. His vision of a unified world under one ruler was unattainable. His generals, though brilliant in their own right, were unable to hold the empire together. The continuous infighting for control over the vast territories Alexander had conquered only served to fragment the empire further, and the regions that had once been part of his unified realm soon found themselves ruled by different, often competing, dynasties. For all his military genius and ambition, Alexander was not a politician. He had built an empire through conquest, but he had not developed a sustainable system of governance. His dream of unity, of blending East and West into a single empire, was shattered by the very force that had propelled him to power his military might. In the end, his empire crumbled without his leadership and vision to sustain it. The tragic irony of Alexander's life and legacy lies in the fact that he accomplished so much. He expanded the known world, spread Greek culture across 3 continents, and left behind a legacy that would influence civilizations for millennia, but never had the opportunity to see the results of his conquests. He died young, at the height of his power, and his empire dissolved almost immediately after his death. His achievements were undeniably grand, yet they were also ultimately unfulfilled. His dream of a unified world ruled by a single monarch was never realized, and the empire he built was too vast, too unstable, and too reliant on his personal charisma to endure without him. Yet Alexander's influence endured far beyond his death. His name became synonymous with conquest, and his life, though short, was immortalized in countless myths, legends, and historical accounts. Even today, Alexander the Great is remembered as one of the greatest military commanders in history, a figure who changed the course of the ancient world with his ambition, vision, and drive. His empire may have crumbled, but his legacy as the conqueror who dared to dream of a united world continues to captivate the imagination. Reflection. Alexander the Great's life and legacy are both triumphant and tragic. His conquests and vision for a unified empire stretched the boundaries of the ancient world, and yet, his untimely death left the world he had shaped to fall apart in his absence. While his empire fragmented and his political vision remained unfulfilled, the cultural legacy he left behind was immense and lasting. The influence of Greek culture, which Alexander spread across the East, would continue to shape the future of Western civilization for centuries. His life reminds us that even the greatest of empires are fragile, and that the true test of a legacy lies not just in military might, but in the lasting impact of ideas and culture. The Roman Empire, with its legions of disciplined soldiers and vast territorial conquests, became a symbol of power, order, and expansion. One of the most storied and feared units in the Roman army was the Ninth Legion, known as Legio IX Hispana. This legion was established in the 1st century BCE, and it quickly became one of the most elite forces in the Roman military. The Ninth Legion gained renown for its campaigns across Europe, from the Iberian Peninsula to the frontiers of Germania. Its victories in various battles and its loyalty to Rome made it one of the most celebrated legions in history. However, the Ninth Legion's story would not end in the glory and triumph typical of Rome's legions. In the early 2nd century CE, the Ninth Legion mysteriously disappeared from historical records. The last known mention of its activities was during a campaign in Britain under the command of the Roman general Publius Ostorius Scapula, where it was stationed in the northern part of the island, near what is now Scotland. After this campaign, the Ninth Legion seemingly vanished, with no further official mention of it in any records. The disappearance of the Ninth Legion has since become one of history's greatest military mysteries. How could a legion so integral to Roman military power simply disappear without a trace? No definitive account exists of what happened to the Ninth Legion, but numerous theories have emerged over the centuries, ranging from battlefield disaster to rebellion and even betrayal. The last known historical reference to the Ninth Legion was around 108 CE, when it was stationed in Roman Britain as part of the Roman conquest of the northern territories. During this time, Rome was engaged in a campaign to subdue the Pictish tribes in what is now Scotland. The region was difficult to conquer due to its rough terrain, harsh weather, and fiercely independent tribal populations. It was also strategically significant for controlling Roman influence in Britain. The Ninth Legion's mission was to build forts, protect Roman interests, and engage in battle against these indigenous tribes. The most popular theory surrounding the disappearance of the Ninth Legion is that it was wiped out during a battle with the Picts around 117 CE. According to some historical accounts, the legion was sent northward under the command of Quintus Petilius Cerealis, a Roman general, to crush a Pictish rebellion. After engaging in a series of skirmishes, the legion is said to have been ambushed by Pictish forces in the dense forests and difficult terrain of the Scottish Highlands. The Romans, caught off guard by the fierce resistance of the Picts and the unforgiving geography, were unable to overcome the attack. It is believed that the entire legion was destroyed, with little or no survivors to return and report on the defeat. There are other theories, however, that suggest a different fate for the Ninth Legion. Some believe that the legion may have been sent on a secret mission, only to have been lost in the wilderness of Britain or beyond. Others suggest that the legion could have been sent to a new posting on the continent, with its records lost or never officially documented. However, the lack of any clear record, coupled with the silence in Roman sources after the 2nd century, has left the question open to speculation. What makes the disappearance of the Ninth Legion even more intriguing is that there is no conclusive evidence to support any of these theories. Roman historian Tacitus, writing in the 1st century, made no mention of the legion's loss, nor did other contemporary sources like Suetonius or Dio Cassius. The complete lack of any record of its fate, whether it was destroyed in battle, reassigned, or mysteriously disappeared, has created an air of mystery around one of Rome's most formidable legions. The disappearance of the Ninth Legion has long intrigued historians, archaeologists, and military enthusiasts alike. Given the absence of concrete historical records, several theories have been proposed to explain the fate of this powerful Roman unit. While we may never know with certainty what happened to the Ninth Legion, the stories that have emerged offer insights into the challenges and uncertainties faced by the Roman Empire during its imperial expansion. 1. The destruction in battle. The most widely accepted theory is that the Ninth Legion was utterly destroyed during a military campaign against the Picts in northern Britain. This idea, though popular, is still shrouded in ambiguity. According to some versions of the story, the legion was stationed near the Antonine Wall, a Roman fortification built to defend against the Pictish tribes in modern-day Scotland. After engaging in a series of skirmishes with the local tribes, the legion was allegedly ambushed by the Picts in a well-coordinated attack. The theory suggests that the Ninth Legion, unprepared for the intensity of the attack, was overwhelmed and destroyed in the thick forests and rugged terrain of the Scottish Highlands. This narrative is bolstered by the fact that no further mentions of the Ninth Legion appear in Roman records, leading some to assume that the entire legion was wiped out in this battle. The lack of survivors or any official reports of the aftermath has fueled speculation that the defeat was so catastrophic that it was kept out of the public eye to protect the reputation of Rome's military. 2. Desertion and rebellion. Another theory proposes that the Ninth Legion did not die in battle, but rather went missing due to desertion or rebellion. Some historians believe that the legion, tired of prolonged campaigns in Britain and possibly frustrated with the political instability in Rome, may have defected. The harsh conditions of the northern frontier, combined with tensions within the ranks, may have led to a revolt or mass desertion, causing the legion to disappear from official Roman records. One theory posits that a group of soldiers from the Ninth Legion, perhaps led by a charismatic officer or disillusioned commander, decided to leave Roman service and integrate with the local tribes in Britain. They could have either gone into hiding in the wilds of Scotland or crossed into the lands of the Picts, where they may have been absorbed into the local culture. This scenario, though largely speculative, aligns with the idea of a legion lost without a trace, its records intentionally erased or simply forgotten. 3. Reassigned and lost to history. A third theory is that the Ninth Legion was not destroyed at all, but instead reassigned to a different part of the empire, with its records lost in the bureaucratic chaos of the time. Roman military units were frequently rotated between different postings, and it is entirely possible that the Ninth Legion was transferred to another frontier, such as the eastern or southern provinces, after its deployment in Britain. However, the lack of documentation surrounding such a move, coupled with the sudden silence surrounding the legion, makes this theory difficult to prove. This theory is supported by some ancient sources, which suggest that Roman commanders often sought to move their forces to new, more peaceful regions after long and arduous campaigns. Given the tumultuous nature of Roman military administration during the 1st and 2nd centuries CE, it is plausible that the Ninth Legion was quietly reassigned, with its records never being properly maintained or updated. 4. The disbandment and the lost legion. Another possibility is that the Ninth Legion was not destroyed or lost to desertion, but rather disbanded after its service in Britain. Some historians have suggested that, after the Antonine Wall was abandoned and the Roman presence in Britain was significantly reduced, the Ninth Legion was simply dissolved. This could explain the lack of documentation. the legion may have been disbanded and its soldiers redistributed to other legions, leaving no singular record of its final days. This theory is less dramatic than the idea of a dramatic military loss or a mass desertion, but it makes sense in the context of the Roman Empire's constant restructuring of its forces. When a legion was no longer needed or was deemed ineffective, it could be disbanded and its soldiers reassigned to other units. If this was the case, the Ninth Legion's disappearance may have been quietly swept under the rug, with no further mention made of its dissolution. 5. The legend and the myth of the Ninth Legion. The mystery of the Ninth Legion has taken on a life of its own over the centuries, becoming the subject of legend, myth, and speculation. The gap in the historical record, combined with the dramatic nature of the theory of its destruction, has led to numerous retellings of the Legion's fate. In some modern interpretations, the Ninth Legion has become a symbol of doomed military ambition, and its story has inspired numerous works of fiction, from novels to films and television series. One of the most famous fictionalized accounts of the Ninth Legion's disappearance is the 2011 film The Eagle, which is based on the historical novel The Eagle of the Ninth by Rosemary Sutcliffe. In this story, the Legion is said to have marched into the misty Scottish Highlands and disappeared without a trace, with the protagonist embarking on a quest to uncover the truth about their fate. While such representations are speculative and romanticized, they have nonetheless captured the imagination of audiences and kept the mystery of the Ninth Legion alive in popular culture. Conclusion: the legacy of the Ninth Legion. The disappearance of the Ninth Legion remains one of the most intriguing unsolved mysteries of Roman military history. Whether the Legion was wiped out in battle, went rogue, was reassigned, or disbanded, its fate is shrouded in ambiguity, leaving historians and archaeologists to speculate on the true cause of its disappearance. Yet, the mystery of the Ninth Legion's vanishing speaks to a larger truth about the Roman Empire itself. Despite its vastness and apparent invincibility, even Rome's greatest military forces were not immune to the complexities and uncertainties of empire building. The story of the Ninth Legion's disappearance, whether tragic or mundane, is a reminder of the impermanence of even the most formidable of powers. Though the Ninth Legion may have vanished from history, its legacy remains an enduring symbol of the fragility of empire and the mysteries that still linger in the pages of ancient history. Cleopatra VII, the last pharaoh of Egypt, is remembered as one of history's most fascinating and enigmatic figures. Her name is synonymous with beauty, power, and political intrigue. Yet, behind the romanticized image of her relationships with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, there lies a more complex story, one that is marked by ambition, manipulation, and tragedy. Born in 69 BCE, Cleopatra was a member of the Ptolemaic dynasty, a Greek family that had ruled Egypt since the time of Alexander the Great's general, Ptolemy I. Despite her royal lineage, Cleopatra's early life was not one of guaranteed success. When her father, Ptolemy XII, died in 51 BCE, Cleopatra was thrust into a power struggle with her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII. As was the custom in Egyptian royalty, they were initially meant to rule together as co-regents, but their relationship soon turned sour. Cleopatra was intelligent, politically astute, and deeply invested in preserving Egypt's independence. She sought to navigate the complex political landscape of the Mediterranean world, which was dominated by the rising power of Rome. Her relationships with two of Rome's most powerful leaders, Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, would shape her reign and leave an indelible mark on history. 48 BCE, Cleopatra met Julius Caesar, who had come to Egypt during a campaign in the east. The political situation in Egypt had become unstable, and Cleopatra saw in Caesar a potential ally. The infamous story of Cleopatra sneaking into Caesar's presence in a carpet or bedroll, depending on the source, is often romanticized, but it speaks to her cunning and determination. She quickly won Caesar's favor, and he helped her secure her throne, defeating her brother in battle. With Caesar's support, Cleopatra solidified her position as the sole ruler of Egypt, though their relationship also resulted in her bearing Caesar a son, Caesarion. After Caesar's assassination in 44 BCE, Cleopatra aligned herself with Mark Antony, one of Caesar's most trusted generals. Their alliance, both political and personal, would come to define Cleopatra's final years. Together, they sought to challenge the growing influence of Rome's rulers, including Octavian, Caesar's adopted son, and the future first emperor of Rome. Cleopatra's relationship with Antony and their combined ambitions set the stage for the eventual fall of both. Antony's rivalry with Octavian, who would later become Augustus, escalated into a full-blown war for control of the Roman Empire. In 31 BCE, the forces of Antony and Cleopatra were decisively defeated by Octavian's fleet at the Battle of Actium. This defeat marked the beginning of the end for the Egyptian queen and her Roman lover. The aftermath of the Battle of Actium in 31 BCE marked the decisive moment in the fall of both Mark Antony and Cleopatra. Following their defeat, the once powerful couple fled to Egypt, where they hoped to regroup and prepare for further resistance. But the tide of history had turned decisively in favor of Octavian, Julius Caesar's adopted son, who would soon be known as Augustus, the first emperor of Rome. Cleopatra's political and military efforts had been centered around her partnership with Antony, but the defeat at Actium shattered her hopes of retaining power. With Rome's army closing in on Alexandria, the capital of Egypt, Cleopatra and Antony found themselves cornered. The final months of their reign were marked by a desperate and tragic series of events. As Octavian's forces approached Alexandria in 30 BCE, Antony received false reports that Cleopatra had already committed suicide. Distraught, he fell on his own sword, a symbolic act of despair and defeat. He was carried to Cleopatra's palace, where he died in her arms. The death of Antony, her lover and political partner, left Cleopatra with little hope for a future. In the face of inevitable defeat, Cleopatra sought to negotiate with Octavian, hoping to preserve her life and Egypt's independence. She was well aware of the power dynamics at play, and she likely hoped that Octavian would offer her a dignified position, as had been the case with other conquered monarchs. However, Octavian had no intention of allowing Cleopatra to retain power. He viewed her not only as a rival, but also as a symbol of the old, powerful monarchy that had once stood in opposition to Roman authority. Faced with the prospect of being paraded in a Roman triumph, an embarrassing public display of defeat, Cleopatra made a fateful decision. According to ancient sources, she and her two remaining attendants took their own lives. The most widely accepted account is that Cleopatra used a venomous asp, a type of snake, to end her life, though some historians have suggested she may have taken poison or used another method. The death of Cleopatra in 30 BCE marked the end of the Ptolemaic dynasty and the final loss of Egypt's independence. After her death, Egypt was annexed by Rome and became a province under the direct control of Octavian. This was a significant moment in history, as it marked the end of the last major independent kingdom in the Mediterranean world and the consolidation of Roman power across the entire region. Cleopatra, whose life had been defined by her political acumen, her relationships with powerful Roman leaders, and her determination to protect Egypt, left behind a complex legacy. In her death, she became both a symbol of defiance and tragedy, a queen who had tried to preserve her kingdom against the overwhelming force of Roman power. Cleopatra's death, though marking the end of an era for Egypt, did not diminish her presence in the annals of history. Over the centuries, her legacy has been shaped by both her remarkable reign and the powerful myths and narratives that have surrounded her. In the aftermath of her defeat, Cleopatra was not simply forgotten. Instead, her story was immortalized in literature, art, and political discourse, where she became a symbol of both seduction and political astuteness. The immediate consequence of Cleopatra's death was the consolidation of power in Rome under Octavian. Egypt was annexed into the Roman Empire, and its riches, once the lifeblood of Egyptian royalty, were now absorbed into the imperial coffers. Despite this, Cleopatra's influence continued to resonate across the Mediterranean world. Her life and death were woven into the narratives of the time, serving as a cautionary tale about the fragility of power and the consequences of defying Rome. Cleopatra in Roman culture. One of the most significant aspects of Cleopatra's legacy is her portrayal in Roman and later Western literature. Immediately following her death, Cleopatra became the subject of Roman propaganda. Octavian sought to paint her as a manipulative foreign queen who had bewitched two of Rome's greatest leaders, Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, ultimately leading to their downfall. The Roman historian Suetonius depicted her as a seductress who sought to undermine Rome's dominance and lead its rulers astray. In contrast to this Roman narrative, later historians and writers reimagined Cleopatra in a different light. In the Renaissance, she became a symbol of both intellect and allure, an example of a woman who used her beauty and intelligence to navigate a male-dominated world. Playwrights such as William Shakespeare helped cement this romanticized view of Cleopatra, with his play Antony and Cleopatra portraying her as both a tragic lover and a powerful queen, caught between her love for Antony and her duty to Egypt. In the 19th and 20th centuries, Cleopatra's image became more complex. She was no longer merely the seductress of Roman propaganda, but a more nuanced figure, one who was praised for her intellect, political savvy, and commitment to Egypt's independence. Historians began to focus more on her achievements, her role as a ruler, her ability to speak several languages, and her strategic alliances with Caesar and Antony rather than just her romantic entanglements. Cleopatra's influence on Egyptian culture and beyond. Though Cleopatra's reign was relatively short-lived, her influence on Egyptian culture endured even after her death. She was the last of the Ptolemaic dynasty, which had ruled Egypt for nearly 3 centuries after the death of Alexander the Great. The Ptolemies, of Greek descent, had ruled over Egypt in a period of relative stability, but Cleopatra was the last of her line to attempt to maintain Egypt's independence. Under her rule, Cleopatra worked to revive the ancient traditions of Egypt and promoted its religious culture. She sought to present herself as a living goddess, aligning herself with the Egyptian goddess Isis, and even depicted herself in statues and coins as a divine figure. Her ability to merge the Hellenistic and Egyptian traditions allowed her to maintain power in a politically unstable world. Her reign is also marked by her efforts to promote Egyptian agricultural and economic strength. As an ambitious and shrewd ruler, Cleopatra was focused on restoring Egypt's wealth and ensuring its future prosperity, especially after the devastation caused by years of internal conflict and Roman interference. While Egypt's political independence was lost after her death, Cleopatra's attempts to maintain Egypt's cultural and economic legacy resonated in the subsequent centuries. Even as Egypt became a province of Rome, the image of Cleopatra as Egypt's last pharaoh lingered in the minds of many, and she remained a symbol of Egypt's enduring cultural significance. The enduring myth of Cleopatra. Cleopatra's death, so dramatic and entwined with political ambition, has been retold and reinterpreted throughout history. Her story is one of both tragedy and triumph, a complex narrative of a woman who fought to preserve her country's independence and her personal legacy against overwhelming odds. In her final moments, she chose to die rather than be paraded as a trophy of Roman conquest, solidifying her place in history as a symbol of defiance, strength, and political acumen. Her legacy has been shaped as much by the myths and interpretations surrounding her as by her actual achievements. Cleopatra has been seen as the archetypal femme fatale, but also as a powerful queen who used her intelligence and charm to navigate the male-dominated world of Roman politics. In this way, her image has been both constructed and reconstructed to suit the needs and perspectives of the times. In modern culture, Cleopatra remains a figure of fascination, appearing in countless books, films, and artworks. She is a symbol of beauty, ambition, and power qualities that transcend time and continue to captivate people's imaginations. From Elizabeth Taylor's iconic portrayal of Cleopatra in the 1963 film to her role as a symbol of female empowerment and political ambition, Cleopatra's image continues to evolve, yet her essence remains unchanged. A queen who defied the odds and sought to preserve her kingdom against the might of Rome. Reflection. Cleopatra's life and death remind us of the complexities of power and identity. Her story is one of brilliance and tragedy, of a ruler who dared to challenge the greatest empire of the ancient world, only to see her dreams fade with her death. Yet, in her defiance and in the legacy she left behind, Cleopatra remains an enduring figure, a queen who, despite her fall, shaped history and captured the imaginations of generations long after her death. In many ways, her story is a timeless reminder that the legacies of great leaders are not always measured by their victories, but by the myths they create and the lasting impact they leave on the world. Carthage, a Phoenician city-state located in what is now Tunisia, was once one of the most powerful and prosperous empires of the ancient world. Founded by Phoenician colonists from Tyre around the 9th century BCE, Carthage quickly grew into a dominant maritime power in the western Mediterranean. Unlike Rome, which was still in its formative stages at the time, Carthage controlled vast trade networks, ruled over rich territories in North Africa, and possessed one of the most formidable navies in the world. The Carthaginian Empire's wealth came from its trade in precious metals, textiles, and agricultural goods, as well as its control over crucial shipping routes. The city-state was also renowned for its military prowess, particularly its navy, which allowed it to maintain dominance over the Mediterranean and expand its influence. Carthage's economy was based on a combination of seafaring prowess, agricultural production, and skilled craftsmanship, making it a prosperous and influential power in the ancient world. By the 3rd century BCE, Carthage had become Rome's most significant rival for control of the Mediterranean. The two powers clashed over various territorial disputes, particularly in Sicily, where both sought control of the strategic island. What followed were the Punic Wars, a series of 3 wars between Rome and Carthage that would define the fate of both empires and ultimately result in the destruction of Carthage itself. The First Punic War, 264–41 BCE, was fought primarily over control of Sicily. It was a long and bitter conflict, marked by naval battles, sieges, and shifting alliances. Despite Carthage's superior navy, Rome managed to build its own fleet and eventually won the war, gaining control of Sicily. The war left Carthage weakened, but it also set the stage for an even greater rivalry between the two powers. The Second Punic War, 218–01 BCE, was the most famous and destructive of the 3 wars, largely due to the military genius of the Carthaginian general Hannibal Barca. Hannibal's daring crossing of the Alps with his war elephants remains one of the most remarkable military feats in history. His army defeated the Romans in several major battles, including the famous Battle of Cannae in 216 BCE, where the Roman forces suffered a catastrophic defeat. Despite Hannibal's brilliance, Carthage was unable to capitalize on its successes, and Rome, under the leadership of Scipio Africanus, eventually turned the tide. In 202 BCE, at the Battle of Zama, Scipio defeated Hannibal, forcing Carthage to sue for peace. The city's power was severely curtailed, and it was forced to give up its territories, pay reparations to Rome, and restrict its military forces. However, Carthage's story was not over. The city's merchants and generals still held significant power, and many Carthaginians harbored a desire for revenge against Rome. This desire would eventually lead to the Third Punic War, 149–146 BCE, the final conflict between the two powers and the ultimate downfall of Carthage. The Third Punic War, which took place between 149 and 146 BCE, was the final and most brutal chapter in the centuries-long rivalry between Rome and Carthage. Despite its weakened state after the Second Punic War, Carthage had managed to rebuild its economy and retain a sense of power, albeit under stringent restrictions imposed by Rome. However, many Romans, particularly those in the Senate, still viewed Carthage as a threat one that needed to be utterly destroyed to prevent any future challenges to Roman supremacy. The immediate cause of the Third Punic War was Carthage's conflict with its neighbor, Numidia, a kingdom located to the west of Carthage. The Carthaginians were involved in a series of border skirmishes with Numidia, which was a Roman ally. Rome, seeing this as a breach of the peace treaty that had been imposed after the Second Punic War, used the incident as a pretext to declare war on Carthage. The Roman statesman Cato the Elder was particularly vocal in his desire for the complete destruction of Carthage, often ending his speeches with the now famous phrase, "Carthago delenda est," Carthage must be destroyed. The Carthaginians, despite their limited military resources, decided to defend their city. They had learned from the previous wars that resistance to Rome required not just military strength, but also unity and resolve. The city's leaders, including the general Hasdrubal, attempted to fortify their defenses, while the people of Carthage rallied to the cause, despite knowing the odds were overwhelmingly against them. The Romans, led by the consul Publius Cornelius Scipio Aemilianus, the grandson of Scipio Africanus, who had defeated Hannibal in the Second Punic War, launched a brutal siege of Carthage in 149 BCE. The city, which had once been one of the wealthiest and most powerful in the ancient world, found itself surrounded by Roman forces, cut off from any potential reinforcements or supplies. For 3 years, Carthage held out against the Roman siege, enduring starvation, disease, and increasingly desperate conditions. The Roman siege was relentless. Scipio Aemilianus employed the full might of Rome's military power, constructing massive siege works including ramps and towers to breach the city's formidable walls. The Carthaginians, led by their desperate leaders, fought fiercely, but they were slowly being worn down. Even though Carthage had been disarmed after the Second Punic War, they still had some forces capable of mounting a defense. Yet the power imbalance was clear, and despite a few heroic attempts to break the siege, the Carthaginians were eventually overrun. In 146 BCE, after 3 years of intense siege warfare, the Romans finally breached the walls of Carthage. What followed was a horrific and brutal act of conquest. The Romans did not simply sack the city, they systematically destroyed it. The streets of Carthage ran red with blood as the Romans slaughtered the defenders and civilians alike. Carthage was burned to the ground, its buildings reduced to rubble, and its people either killed or enslaved. The city was completely annihilated, and its former grandeur became a memory of the past. The destruction of Carthage marked the end of an era. The Carthaginian Empire, once a dominant power in the Mediterranean, was no more. Its territories were absorbed into the Roman Republic, and the once great city was left as a pile of ruins. The Roman historian Plutarch later described the aftermath of the siege, noting that the Romans were so thorough in their destruction that they even sowed salt into the earth, ensuring that nothing would grow there again. While it's debated whether this act actually took place, the symbolism of salt as a marker of the city's permanent destruction resonated with Roman propaganda. The Roman Senate's decision to destroy Carthage was a moment of finality, a decision to erase the memory of their greatest rival and remove any possibility of Carthage rising again. Carthage had once threatened Rome's dominance, and in the Third Punic War, Rome made sure it would never rise again. The city was reduced to nothing but a symbol of Roman supremacy, a reminder of what could happen to those who defied Rome's will. The destruction of Carthage in 146 BCE was not just the end of a city, it was the annihilation of an empire and a turning point in the Mediterranean world. With the complete erasure of Carthage, Rome had secured its dominance over the western Mediterranean and effectively removed the only remaining threat to its imperial ambitions. Yet in the aftermath of Carthage's destruction, Rome faced both triumph and lingering questions about the moral and strategic implications of such a brutal conquest. The immediate aftermath, Roman domination and the fate of Carthage's legacy. Following the fall of Carthage, Rome quickly moved to incorporate its lands into its growing empire. The territories of Carthage, including the rich agricultural land of North Africa, became part of the Roman province of Africa Proconsularis. This region would prove to be one of the most important provinces in the Roman Empire, supplying Rome with crucial grain and resources, ensuring that the empire could sustain its population and its military. Though Carthage had been obliterated as a political and military force, its commercial and cultural legacy lived on. The Carthaginian trading routes, once the lifeblood of the Mediterranean, were gradually absorbed by Roman merchants, and the influence of the Carthaginian economy continued to shape the Roman world. In fact, the Carthaginian maritime network, although absorbed into Rome, would contribute to the development of Roman naval power in later centuries. Even in the face of its destruction, Carthage's contributions to Mediterranean civilization were not forgotten. The Carthaginian innovations in agriculture, shipbuilding, and trade continued to influence Roman practices. Some historians argue that the development of Roman grain farming in North Africa was heavily shaped by the agricultural techniques first developed by the Carthaginians. The economic systems that the Carthaginians had built helped sustain the Roman Empire in the centuries to come, even as the cultural and political identity of Carthage was erased from history. The psychological and cultural impact of the destruction of Carthage. The fall of Carthage left a significant mark on Roman identity, especially in terms of the collective psyche. The Romans were deeply invested in their sense of moral and cultural superiority, and the total destruction of Carthage served as a stark symbol of the power of Roman law and order. In many ways, the Romans saw the destruction of Carthage as a necessary step to secure their empire and ensure peace in the Mediterranean. However, the annihilation of Carthage also raised uncomfortable questions about the nature of Roman expansion. In Cato the Elder's infamous speeches, he had urged the Senate to destroy Carthage, claiming that as long as Carthage existed, it would be a threat to Rome. Cato's repeated call to eliminate Carthage entirely, his famous declaration, Carthago delenda est, Carthage must be destroyed, is often viewed as the expression of Roman resolve to not only defeat their rival, but to utterly erase its presence from history. This absolute destruction of a once great empire, leaving nothing but ruins behind, also left a mark on Roman morality. While the Romans justified the annihilation of Carthage as necessary for the preservation of Roman peace and security, they were aware of the heavy cost. The entire population of Carthage, estimated to be between 100,000 and 150,000 people, was either killed or sold into slavery. The city itself was leveled, with all its grandeur and history wiped from the map. For many, the destruction of Carthage marked the point where Roman imperialism began to take on a darker, more merciless character. While Carthage's military threat had been neutralized and its lands absorbed, the moral and philosophical consequences of its destruction would continue to haunt Rome for generations. Was it truly necessary to destroy a city to such an extent, or had Rome gone too far in seeking vengeance? The eternal symbol of Carthage's fall. The destruction of Carthage and the subsequent victory of Rome ensured that the Roman Republic would continue to dominate the Mediterranean world for centuries. Rome's victory over Carthage also solidified the city's role as the leading imperial power of the ancient world, a power that would eventually transform into the Roman Empire under Augustus. Despite Carthage's destruction, its story has not been forgotten. The tale of its fall has inspired countless discussions on the nature of war, the consequences of imperialism, and the price of empire. The destruction of Carthage, while a powerful symbol of Roman might, also serves as a warning about the dangers of unchecked ambition and the desire for total domination. Interestingly, Carthage's cultural and intellectual legacy survived through the centuries. As previously mentioned, Carthaginian innovations in trade, agriculture, and shipbuilding became part of the Roman legacy. Additionally, Carthaginian religious practices, particularly those involving the worship of gods like Baal and Tanit, influenced the religious practices of later civilizations in the Mediterranean world. While the political power of Carthage was erased, its influence on Mediterranean culture remained in subtle ways. Moreover, the story of Carthage's destruction has been retold throughout history as a powerful symbol of both Roman success and the dangers of rivalry. It has appeared in literature, art, and popular culture as an allegory for the costs of imperial conquest. The phrase, Carthago delenda est, though originally a Roman battle cry, has transcended its origins, often used as a symbol of the need to utterly eliminate a rival or threat. Reflection: the enduring legacy of Carthage's fall. The fall of Carthage represents not just the end of an empire, but the triumph of Rome over its greatest rival. Yet, in the ashes of Carthage, there is a deep reflection on the consequences of empire building. While Rome emerged victorious, the destruction of Carthage stands as a reminder of the often devastating cost of imperial ambition. The story of Carthage, from its rise to its fall, remains a significant chapter in the history of the ancient Mediterranean. It serves as a reminder that empires, no matter how powerful, are subject to the whims of fortune, and their fates are shaped by the decisions of leaders, soldiers, and the societies they govern. In the end, Carthage's destruction, while cementing Rome's place in history, also set the stage for future questions about the morality of war, conquest, and the costs of total victory. Though the city was lost, the memory of Carthage continues to resonate as one of the great stories of the ancient world, a story of ambition, rivalry, and the tragic consequences of imperial overreach. The story of the Roanoke colony is one of America's most enduring mysteries, a tale of ambition, survival, and unexplained disappearance that has captured the imagination of historians and the public for centuries. The colony, established in 1585, was part of England's first attempt to establish a permanent settlement in the New World. It was intended to be the beginning of a thriving English presence in North America, but what followed would be one of the most baffling disappearances in history. The story began with Sir Walter Raleigh, an ambitious English explorer who was granted a charter by Queen Elizabeth I to establish a colony in the Americas. Raleigh's plan was to establish a strategic foothold in the New World, one that could help England compete with Spain, the dominant colonial power at the time. In 1585, he sent an expedition to the coast of what is now North Carolina, aiming to establish a permanent settlement. The first group of settlers, led by Sir Richard Grenville, arrived on the shores of Roanoke Island, located off the coast of modern-day North Carolina, in July 1585. The settlers were tasked with establishing a fortified settlement and exploring the surrounding area for resources that could be used to further England's ambitions in the New World. The colony was intended to be the first English-speaking community in the Americas, but from the start, the settlers faced numerous challenges, including a lack of supplies, difficult terrain, and tension with local Native American tribes. In the fall of 1585, Sir Richard Grenville left Roanoke to return to England for supplies. He promised to return as soon as possible with reinforcements, but by the time he finally returned in 1590, the colony had mysteriously vanished. In the interim, an additional group of settlers led by John White had arrived at Roanoke in 1587, further solidifying England's claim on the region. White, a seasoned artist and explorer, was tasked with leading the second attempt at settlement on Roanoke Island. His group consisted of men, women, and children, including his own daughter, Virginia Dare, who became the first English child born in the Americas. However, White's return to England for supplies soon turned into a prolonged absence. When he finally returned in 1590, after a delay of 3 years due to war with Spain and other logistical issues, he found the colony completely deserted. There was no sign of struggle or any indication of what had happened to the settlers. The only clue left behind was the word Croatoan carved into a tree, and the letters CRO etched into a nearby post. Despite searching the surrounding areas, White and his men found no trace of the settlers. There were no bodies, no evidence of battle or hardship, and no definitive explanation for the disappearance. The colony had simply vanished. This marked the beginning of one of the greatest unsolved mysteries in American history. What happened to the Roanoke colony? The disappearance of the Roanoke colony has remained one of history's most intriguing and perplexing mysteries. Over the centuries, many theories have been proposed to explain the fate of the settlers. These theories range from plausible scenarios to more speculative ideas, but no one theory has been able to definitively explain what happened to the colony. The search for answers has sparked countless investigations, debates, and even legends, making the Roanoke mystery an enduring part of American folklore. 1. The Native American theory, integration with local tribes. One of the most widely accepted theories is that the Roanoke settlers were absorbed by local Native American tribes. The word Croatoan, carved into a tree by the settlers, has often been linked to the Croatoan tribe, a Native American group living on an island near Roanoke, now Hatteras Island. It is believed that the settlers may have fled to the nearby Croatoan Island to escape hostile relations with other Native American groups or due to a lack of supplies and food. This theory posits that the settlers either assimilated into the Croatoan tribe or were taken in by them for protection. Some of the settlers may have lived peacefully with the Croatoan tribe, adopting their customs and language, while others might have been absorbed into nearby tribes. It is worth noting that some settlers may have left marks or signs of their presence, but these signs were not recognized by White or the English expedition when they arrived to search for the colony. There is some historical evidence that suggests that English settlers did integrate with Native American groups in the region. In later years, accounts from settlers in the area mention that they had encountered strange people who spoke some English and had European-style features. It is possible that these individuals were descendants of the Roanoke colonists who had joined the local tribes. However, this theory also faces challenges. The Roanoke settlers had left behind some tools and personal items in their settlement, which suggests that they did not plan to leave the island. Additionally, later searches by English expeditions did not find conclusive evidence of the settlers living with local tribes, making this theory somewhat speculative. 2. The starvation and death theory. Another theory posits that the settlers perished due to starvation, disease, or a lack of supplies. When White left for England in 1587, he had planned to return within a few months with more supplies, but his return was delayed by the war with Spain and the complications of returning to the Americas. This extended absence may have left the colony without adequate food or resources, leading to widespread starvation or sickness. The harsh conditions of the New World, lack of proper nutrition, illness, and the difficulty of surviving in an unfamiliar and often hostile environment may have contributed to the settlers' demise. This theory suggests that, without enough food or assistance, the settlers could have succumbed to disease or malnutrition. If they did not have time to leave the settlement in an organized way, they might have perished before they could seek help or evacuate the island. The problem with this theory is that there is no definitive evidence of mass graves or signs of illness among the remnants left behind by the settlers. Furthermore, if the settlers had indeed died from starvation or disease, it is unclear why there would have been no clear signs of struggle or distress. Had they died suddenly, there might have been more obvious remains or evidence of their attempt to survive. 3. The abandonment theory, a planned relocation. Another possibility is that the settlers left Roanoke voluntarily to relocate to another site. White had instructed the colonists to carve a message if they moved to a new location, with the word Croatoan being the most likely indication that the settlers had moved to Croatoan Island. Some believe that the settlers decided to abandon their original settlement, possibly due to increasing pressure from the hostile tribes or the collapse of their provisions. The theory suggests that the settlers might have moved to a more secure or resource-rich area, intending to survive until help arrived. However, it is puzzling that they left no clear signs or other instructions to indicate their intentions. The fact that the word Croatoan was carved into the tree in an almost casual way raises questions about whether the move was planned or if it was an emergency response to dire circumstances. Additionally, there is no historical evidence that the settlers reached Croatoan Island, and White's search of the area yielded no trace of the colonists. If they had moved, why didn't they leave more substantial evidence of their journey or relocation? This theory remains plausible but lacks sufficient evidence to be fully convincing. 4. The lost colony theory, the destruction of the colony. Some historians and researchers have suggested that the Roanoke colony was simply destroyed by a natural disaster or an attack by a rival tribe, either before or after the settlers' departure. If the settlers were caught in a violent storm or some other environmental disaster, it is possible that they were completely wiped out without any trace of their existence left behind. Similarly, some believe that the settlers could have been attacked and killed by hostile tribes in the region. The early interactions between the English settlers and local tribes were often tense, with violence erupting from time to time. If a particularly aggressive tribe had attacked the settlers, it's possible that the evidence of their deaths was simply buried or removed. However, the absence of bodies or clear signs of an attack makes this theory less likely than others. 5. The myth and the mystery. Over the centuries, the story of the Roanoke colony has taken on a life of its own, steeped in mystery and legend. From rumors of ghostly apparitions to tales of secretive experiments, the lost colony has been the subject of countless speculative theories. Whether the settlers were assimilated by Native American tribes, perished from starvation, or moved to a new location, the truth of their fate remains elusive. The most persistent element of the Roanoke mystery is the enduring symbol of the word Croatoan, carved into the tree. This clue has sparked endless speculation, and many believe it is the key to solving the riddle of what happened to the colonists. Whether the settlers were absorbed by local tribes or vanished for some other reason, the word serves as a reminder of the uncertainty and danger that faced those early explorers of the New World. Even today, Roanoke remains an active archaeological and historical mystery. While there is no definitive solution to the disappearance of the colony, the story of the lost settlers continues to captivate people's imaginations, fueling searches for answers and ensuring that the mystery of the first American colony lives on.